All right. Hello, everyone. I will be running this meeting because Louis is on vacation this week. I believe just for this week. We'll maybe wait 1 or 2 minutes for everyone to join. But in the meantime, I'll find some note takers, and these are the notes. Okay, so it's not too many people to choose from right now, but Pierre and Deem, do you want to take notes?
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, also, it's fine.
Thanks, guys. All right, I think we can get started. Anyone joining late will just join into the call. I'm just looking at the attendee list. To my knowledge, everyone has been on this call before. But if you haven't, please take this chance to introduce yourself. Otherwise, we can move on.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So yeah, my name is Ola and I'm just joining Outmark today. And yeah, I haven't been on this call before. I'll be working on ecosystem development and strategy and partnerships.
Awesome. Nice to have you all in. Very excited that Altark is growing in members. Okay, now we can move on to the updates. So Aragon 1, we can start. From the last call, I think primarily similar to last time, we're mostly making progress on 0.8. We are now at the end of finishing finance, tokens, and voting for 0.8. We have preview.aragon.org as the current internal testing deployment for 0.8. So if you want to see how things are shaping up in the client and with each of the apps, you can visit that URL. And not everything is working yet, but it has basically what's on master on all the current repos. And we continually update that as things get updated. I don't know exactly how well it will work with custom apps because the URLs are basically hard-coded to custom deployments of our current apps. So it won't fetch a new deployment of the planning suite, for example, but you can test that locally using the master branches on the different repos. The other part is the court. And I think there's been quite a lot of progress made since the last time we've discussed it. I think a lot of the pull requests are starting to get merged. And Faku, I think you might be in a better position to describe what's going on with the court.
Hey, sure. In the last week, we've been mostly merging all the stuff that we've been developing, and there were many PRs and branches going around. We basically moved onto a development branch that hopefully will get merged onto master someday. I've been mostly focused on the idea of splitting the court staking part of the protocol, and we've basically been thinking of having like a jurors registry that it's basically one of the main parts of the protocol that is basically hiding or encapsulating all the idea of the complexity that carries the idea of drafting like a huge number of jurors or that is being stored in a tree and so on. So there's a lot of complexity hide under that hood. So yeah, I've been basically working on that. And yeah, I think that's it. I don't know, Jorge, if you would like to add something else, but I think that's what we've been doing so far. And we already started like tackling the testing, a testing strategy for the court. That is something like a separate topic that is huge as well. We've been basically trying to increase all the unit tests coverage for now, but we're also thinking on having like a more complex testing suite or something like that. But yeah, we're still exploring that.
All right. It sounds like Jorge does not have anything to add. I'm not sure he's actually in the call yet. But
Yeah.
we can move on.
Oops.
Oh,
Yeah,
did
sorry.
you add something, Jorge?
Yeah, not much to add. As Facu was saying, a lot of code has been merged, and we're getting very like close to being at 100% implementation. Now we will probably do like another review of some of the parts that have the most complexity, but already planning the next steps for the network.
It's awesome to hear. So if you haven't looked at the court recently, we can also share the GitHub link in the notes in here. This would be a great chance. But otherwise, I think that's it for Aragon 1.
Okay, so for us, main focus the first week of the cycle was on finalizing profiles, which we put up a preview to before the vote. The only thing that needs to be done there is to create a provider in the wrapper, which we probably won't get to during this 2-week cycle, but we will probably be addressing the one after that. Potentially the address book provider we'll look into during this cycle, and there'll be some coordination around that. We made the changes needed to rewards and address book based on the response that we got from the auditors, which they're reviewing currently. We also finished the upgrades to allocations in preparation for an internal audit, and after that, it'll be ready for our auditors. We finalized changes to dot voting and are currently wrapping up our internal audit to hand off to the auditors today for dot voting. We started upgrading address book with the new Aragon UI components, which again should be done probably today. It was started last week. The first one's took us about a week, but we expect to see like an increase in speed going forward now that we've got a familiarity with that. We finalized contract code for token manager whitelisting, and the only thing that needs to be done for that is the UI. And then that'll be ready. But I know that the next Aragon apps release cycle is ways away. So once that code is finished, we'll probably just shelve it until we figure out where to go next with that. We continued work on integrating discussions into dot voting, which is going all right. More update on that at the next meeting. Ideally, that'll be wrapped up as well. External intents got accepted. John can speak more on that potentially. And then internally, we decided to shift away from 2 weeks or 1 week sprints. We've done both at this point in favor of like longer cycles with more feature focus. So that may affect the cadence of our work going forward. We'll see how that evolves in these calls. And then, yeah, going forward, most of these have already been touched on, but we're going to be working on comments for the forwarder API. Right now, Chad's working on the caching, and Kevin's working on all the other comments. So those should be wrapped up in probably by mid to end of this week. We need to update the UI of the token manager in response to the contract changes. Continuing with the security audit engagement, it includes a few things, mostly wrapping up dot voting, making sure allocations are ready to hand off and responding to any changes to request. And then we will ideally be finished upgrading to the new design system over this period. And yeah, if we run into any problems here, Roddick says you've been fairly responsive for that, so we'll continue to ask about that. And then the only thing that's left from AGP 19 that needs major work is organization settings. So that's going to be one of our large focuses over this next 2-week period. And then John will also be wrapping up discussions. So John, do you want to speak on any of those things quickly?
You did a pretty good job. I don't really have much else to add there. Yeah, I guess one last thing is the Aragon client repo needs just some updates now that external intents is done on the Aragon JS side. So there's a PR up there if you, Brett, wouldn't mind reviewing it. I think it's just a little UI thing left is the only open question. Besides that was pretty good, Arthur.
All right. Then let's move on to Aragon Mesh. I think Gabby, you're here.
Yep. Hi. Okay. From our side, in the past 2 weeks we released a new version and marked it as the new stable. This introduced the previous nightly changes that the most relevant were the IPFS separation and the update for the publish workflow. We also, in this new stable version, introduced some style improvements and hope some UX improvement as well. This version also includes the new Aragon release. That new Aragon includes some updates to the snapshot of the dev chain. This includes the client build already in the snapshots, the new templates that Facu were working, and also we include the open enterprise apps and the payroll app so to be able to use it in the dev chain. You're also able to check the snapshot status that were causing some problems in the past. And then for the next 2 weeks, we were discussing to move to a new version very quickly that remove all the deprecation code and also separate some of the package into the monorepo structure. We also we will like to work in a couple of new features. One that we are really excited is the iteration of Aragon Run that Brett suggested in the Aragon CLI repo. And then we will also like to use the pre-build of the client that we have now in the snapshot to instead of always build it locally, we can reuse that from fetching it from the APM and the snapshot. Yeah, and that will be some tests that we would like to have that be able to fetch information from APM directly instead of depending on building the snapshot every time. So that would be cool as well. So yeah, that's it. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Gabby. Good work on the release for the stable version of Aragon CLI version 6. Very much improved, I think, from version 5, and I think everyone's happy that that's now made it into a stable release. Olivier, if you're here.
Yep.
Yeah. That's Aragon Black.
Yeah, sorry, I got a little late on the call. So yeah, on Aragon Black side, so we are done updating all the contracts to take into account the security audit. So basically the batching system has been improved a lot. We also adjusted the tab to match the new batching system. So now it's pushed and being audited right now. So we're waiting for the feedbacks. the pool contract is being merged into agent. There is the PR open right now. Jorge reviewed it. I think from the contract side, it's fine. I just had to add a couple of tests to because we did a couple of updates during the PR process. So I'm going to update the tests tomorrow. So yeah, on the contract side, we are good. Xavier is now updating the background scripts to basically match the new batching system. Yes, so the only things that are left remaining for fundraising basically end up rewriting the background script, but it should be done pretty quickly, and otherwise updating the template, fundraising kits. So we had a call earlier with Brett to discuss that, and probably I'm going to try to, we're still kind of hesitating about the best strategy because we have some limitation on the contract size and things like that. So I'm going to open a couple of PRs in the template repo by the end of the week, and we'll try to see what's the best fit to basically allow any kind of base organization, whether reputation or corporation or whatever, to be able to include some fundraising application. And beside that, some folks at A1 are also working on, basically one of the feedback we had a lot when talking with external organization willing to fundraise is the need to have some kind of a pre-sale mechanism before the fundraising actually starts. So Luke and sorry, but I forgot the name. Already started working on that, and what we will do is integrate it, the pre-sale functionalities into the controller, which is one of the contracts which is already in place for basic fundraising functionality. And Patty has started doing some sketches about the UI. So I think that with Dim earlier, and he's going to work on implementing this UI soon. I'm not sure we're going to wait for this pre-sale thing to be ready to push to Rinkeby because I think people actually want to test and play with the fundraising UI, and it's cool if we have enough feedback. So probably we're going to try to, I have to sync up with Luke about that, but probably we're going to sync up to Rinkeby as soon as possible, and then include the pre-sale system a little bit later to Rinkeby first and then to mainnet. So let's sit on the fundraising side. So basically dealing with this pre-sale stuff and just updating the kit and doing some research about what can be done with the new template system. And otherwise, Dim has also started working on updating the Pando front end to the new design system. So that's basically once we are done with fundraising, we can also update Pando and push it to mainnet with the latest version of the design system. So yeah, I think that's all on our side.
All right, thanks, Oliver. Glad to hear fundraising is going along well. I think because Louis is on vacation, we don't have a chance to get an update from the Aragon Association, so that will happen during the next call. So we can move right into discussions. And I've kind of been adding things as we go along. But the first thing I think that's important to touch upon is the network vote number 3 that happened in between the time from this call and the last call, which I think was fairly successful. I haven't heard of any major complaint, I guess. And the most perhaps important vote that was passed was Alteric getting their full year of flock funding. So congratulations. And I wanted to leave this here in case we did want to discuss anything from that network vote. Nothing to my mind really has a big impact in the technical side so far, but just in case someone wanted to discuss any of the AGPs that were either approved or rejected. Okay, sounds like we can move on from this. If you're interested in the network vote or the network vote, you can find that on the blog as well as various places such as the forum and etc. Then we can move on to a quick, I guess, announcement / watermark for this product development pipeline I wrote in the form. This was primarily aimed at increasing the coordination between Flock teams, especially as we work on product together. We have perhaps different users we're targeting, different people we're onboarding, and we may have different ideas as to what should go into the client or what features an application needs. And this is mainly out of some experience in the last few months of trying to coordinate this process and not having a really formal way of doing it. So this was kind of just an attempt at making a more formalized approach to this development process. Most of it I stated should happen inside the strategy and product working groups. And the main thing that is to highlight here is that if we do follow this process, announcements will be made in the all devs when significant efforts get started, so everyone is aware that like, oh, this team is working on this, and we're going to need to help them, or we're going to need to help review or do, etc. Just to kind of give developers a pulse check on things that may be coming up in the horizon that they need to care about. But again, this is more of a watermark in case either people had read it and had opinions, or have not read it and may be interested at this point.
Yeah, so just a few points of clarification. The first one, the wording on 6 seems a little ambiguous or easy to be misinterpreted to me. It says champion may not undertake any work itself. Are you trying to express the idea that it's not necessary for the champion to undertake the work?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
The wording on that may not be the best, but yes, it basically says the champion is responsible, but does not necessarily have to be the implementer.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And then just for clarification again, the main difference between the deliverables in step 4 and step 6 is that those deliverables are required at step 6, whereas they're just good to have or nice to have in 4. And the expected materials are the same at both of those, like sort of flagpoles.
Yes, I would say they're not necessarily the same, but it's whatever you have at 4, it makes a better case perhaps, but they become required in much more perhaps fleshed out detail at 6. I mean, fleshed out detail is also kind of ambiguous, but it's just at 6 we should have a very clear idea. At 4, it's like, hey, I have this idea, like we're kind of looking into it, and it looks like we may want to go farther with this. What do you think?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that at least for now, it probably doesn't make sense to have anything like this because it would just be more overhead. But it seems like if there's some sort of like resubmission process, we might want more clarity around like whether there's some sort of like time expectation before something's resubmitted, whether there's an expectation that more support material is expected before it's resubmitted, or like what that process looks like. I think for now it's probably not necessary to add that in, but that's one thing in terms of elements of this process that I feel could potentially be fleshed out more long term. But otherwise, I think a lot of this looks really good and it's pretty logical.
If you want, Arthur, you can make a comment and perhaps we can incorporate that later. The main reason I haven't included a resubmission process is that, yeah, it's a little bit farther out there, but also if it really becomes obvious, I hope that the person who was the original champion is still around to like make it annoying and be like, hey, this is a really big deal now. Like we should look at this.
Yeah, I think I see that as probably just part of number 4 is maybe there was like a feasibility study done, but it just needed more information to make the decision. So that might just be part of like a 4 to 5 loop that can be pretty simple. But otherwise, yeah, if it's like a completely like, no, like this product decision doesn't make sense, then yeah, resubmitting it might not be worth people's time in the near term.
Yeah, I think it's mainly if an external event or circumstance or something happens and it becomes all of a sudden very relevant, that's a good time to resubmit. But it's very hard to detail that in like a process.
Yeah, true.
Is there like a one small idea, just like, is there a incremental way to go about implementing this type of process, like take certain steps and implement them first and see if we like it before trying to like change a much bigger process?
Yeah, I think the biggest one, and this is a good point, is basically steps for, really just step 4 is I think the one that matters the most right now. And this is particularly in regards to adding discussions earlier in the process to the product working group. And so like we share ideas and we greenlight ideas together at a reasonable like early step. And so we're on the same page about like what's going on. That's by far the most important thing. The rest of it is just like to support basically that that coordination.
Yeah, it seems like step 9 too could be one that's like nice to implement now, especially as there are, I feel like, some open PRs. So we could like come up with times to do PR review. You know, I think step 9 could be a nice one to implement too. Yep.
Yeah, if you want, John, please also add your thoughts to here, and definitely we can get started with some of them sooner than others.
Perfect.
Yeah, especially as number 9 kind of relates actually more to the developers than the product working group. Okay, any other comments, or should we move on? Okay, sounds like we can move on. The next item in the list, and by the way, if you have any items, feel free to add them. I think we'll have a little bit more time today. The next one is a Flock Common Aragon APM registry. So this mainly has kind of been an idea that's come out of like deploying new applications. We've kind of gone through different, like various ideas, I guess. One idea is to have each Flock team maintain its own registry. One idea is to just use the open registry. And then we had this other idea from A1 where we were like, what if we just make a flock.aragonpm.eth? And that way it's like a good holding point for things that may not be at either the quality or importance of the applications that are held in just aragonpm.eth. For example, at Aragon 1, we have a couple of applications that could be deployed for customer use, but they haven't been audited. They're fairly simple. They've been internally reviewed, and like we feel perfectly safe with somebody using them. But it's just a question now of like, okay, where do we deploy? What makes most sense? And so we're like, maybe it makes sense if we as Flock teams all share a common repository for this. Right now, the Aragon Association would likely still have the full control over it in terms of like the governance of actually assigning permissions. But if you wanted to make a new repo, you would basically just ask someone to be like, hey, you know, like make a repo, give me permissions, and then it's like my thing afterwards. And this is just kind of also a watermark to see, or a quick temperature check to see like what Altark and Aragon Black think about the strategy.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. I think it could make sense. I mean, on our side for now, we don't really have this kind of use cases where we do basically deploy application which are really like onboarding focused or organization specific or stuff like that. They would like a repo to do so. So it's kind of abstract, but abstractly, I think it's a good idea to have something like that if the use case arises somehow. So yeah, I think it's good. I would just wonder how exactly it will be. So basically, we would just need to ask the association to be able to deploy a new repo inside the registry, right?
Yes, and particularly the the barrier to doing so should be much lower than the main Aragon PM.eth. It should just be like, hey, Louis or somebody else, I want to deploy this. And then it's like, okay, go do that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, I think that's definitely a good idea.
Yeah, no objections here. Sounds good.
And would this be preferable to having Aragon block.aragonpm.eth and altarch.aragonpm.eth?
I would say
Sorry,
yes.
I'm not sure I understood the question. I think the question was have a shared Flock repo or a shared Flock registry or per team specific registry, right?
Yes. Yeah. Which one is more preferable?
Yeah, I will say for this kind of use cases, maybe it makes more sense to have a per team specific registry. Also, because maybe it makes it more clear for the end user that this is in the end ultimately the team which is accountable for the quality of the code and not the whole network. So if there is an issue, then it's up to a black to handle it or something like that.
And Arthur, I think you said the exact opposite.
Yeah, I think that so I guess taking into account the sort of like code accountability factor is one angle. But I think that the ease of access for users, having one place to go to, has benefits as well. So I'd lean towards it for those reasons. Plus, it's like if we had that sort of like lower friction registry, the understanding I would assume is that like we would be working towards moving the things that are in there temporarily towards the primary registry, or is that not an assumed part of the flow? Because I could see like maintaining things under like the autarch registry that are never going to be part of the main registry. But if we think of it as like a sort of like a soft staging or something for things that we eventually want to bring into the main repository, I think it makes sense to have there only be one of those.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yep.
I think primarily the goal is maybe not to have a staging place. But I mean, it could evolve into that too, where maybe it makes sense for this as like an in development or like not as important yet app to be held. I think when we were thinking about using it, it was for applications that would never move into the main Aragon PM registry, or like have a very unlikely chance of doing so because they're just like not as important or not as complicated.
Yeah, so I mean, from my perspective, like a really good example for something that I could see fitting here really well would be like the modified token manager. Because I mean, those are going to be relatively small changes. I think they'll be pretty safe, but at the same time, it doesn't make sense to push those into the main registry until they've gone through some sort of formal audit process. So is that something that you would see living in this registry? Because I think long term, it does make sense for it to be the primary registry. But just as like an example, where do you see that fitting in this pattern?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the main technical difficulty is that moving an app from one registry to the next is actually a very complicated process, and there's not really a good way to do so right now, based on how the smart contracts work. Basically, right now, when you install an application, we've kind of tied it to the registry it's published in, and it's like kind of impossible right now to move it afterwards. So the only recourse you have as a user is to uninstall that application and then reinstall the new one from the other repository. which is really clunky and cumbersome. But so based on what I'm hearing, it sounds like perhaps it makes more sense than for, let's say, applications that one team is responsible for to have their own Aragon PM subdomains, because it provides perhaps a clear separation, and it's not like a staging environment. Like if the apps are never going to be moved into the main Aragon PM repo or like a repository, then it makes sense to kind of stick them in an appropriate namespace based on who created it and who's maintaining it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. My only concern around that approach, I guess, would be, are we going to enforce similar standards around audit cycles for applications that we're publishing to our own namespaces? Because if the understanding is I guess the core applications developed by Autark go under the Autark namespace, will people assume that all of the applications under that namespace are safe to use and have been audited? Because then we still don't really get the utility that having that alternative registry seems to provide.
Yeah, I think it's hard to.
I think that's a good point. Go ahead,
Oh,
Brett.
go on, Oliver. No, I was.
No, sorry. No. No, go ahead.
Okay, I think you might have a second in between us, Oliver. But I think it's hard to like have a generic rule that's like, okay, if it's a flock team, then it means their applications are still audited in their own Aragon PM repository. It's just like it's almost impossible to enforce at that point. I mean, there are things we could build in like the front end and start having various things to say like, okay, you know, this is still trusted and this is not, but it gets kind of mushy at this point.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, what would make the most sense is just having an experimental registry or something to that effect. We communicate the fact that if people are using these in organizations, it's sort of a clunky user experience to uninstall and then reinstall if it does eventually move out of the experimental registry, but at least so that there's a clear indication to users that the applications in that registry have not necessarily gone through some sort of approved process, and whether applications move from that registry to team-specific registries or the main registry, I think is less important. I think the important thing is that we're communicating the difference between like a well-vetted and audited contract and something that's more experimental.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, I think too. And maybe following that rationale, it makes more sense to put everything in the same experimental.aragonpm.et repo registry, because then everyone knows that. And again, it makes everything more readable. Like, okay, there is the main repo and there is this experimental repo, and experimental is experimental. We should not trust it as much as the rest of the packages. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
Also, just to add a point, maybe it will make things easier from an indexation point of view, because we're also working on this Aragon PM front end, and also it will make it easier for people to basically query the main repo, the open repo, and the experimental repo, and to be able to easily display some kind of information about the quality of the repo, depending on if it's the main repo or the main registry. It's like, okay, this is audited and this is supposed to be safe. If it's the open one, it's like, this is really up to you. And if it's the experimental one, we can add a custom placeholder saying, okay, this is from the main flock teams, but still this is not audited. This is prone to move to another registry. So, and maybe also it will make it easier to basically just organize the information in the front end.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I like the perhaps the economies of scale or the centralization of having a single repository. We can also differentiate maintainers based on who publishes, because the creator, you basically know whether it's Aragon 1 or Altark or etc. Just based on the person who created the repo. Yeah. It's also, I think, better for, let's say we need to combine applications. Let's say, for example, we have this approvals app that's basically a yes/no, like clickable button yes/no decision on whether or not to execute a script. If we need to onboard somebody who wants to use that application, but also fundraising or something else that Aragon Black has developed in the experimental repo, it perhaps makes more sense to put it all in one place and for them to know, like, okay, these are kind of some of the more experimental pieces, but they're all kind of coming from a similar place from the same repository versus like 5 different repositories and who knows what's going on with these different repositories.
Yes, exactly.
All right, so it sounds like we should centralize then. We can decide on names, I think, offline, because that's generally just a bike shedding thing. But how does that sound, Arthur and Olivier?
Sounds good.
Yeah, sounds good to me too.
All right, so the next step is, I think Jorge will write a addition to the forum post about Aragon PM, and then we can kind of discuss names also there as to whatever we call it.
Yeah, just
Sounds
also just to add to that, since we are arriving at the end of the fundraising stuff, we're going to have more space on our side to basically do the rest, which is not fundraising, so porno and everything else. So especially me, I'm going to be more free on the smart contract side. So I'm going to start slowly trying to see what to put on the roadmap for the Aragon PM. So there's no rush, but I think I'm going to put the forum post to basically synthesize everything which we have seen there and there. People asking some feature and all. So there's some space, but if you guys start having some ideas about what kind of feature you like to have for the Aragon PM, maybe you can start trying to think about it, and then you can put it into the forum post I'm going to try to write in the next week probably, so that we can have a good idea on what are the requested features and how to prioritize them.
That sounds great, Olivier. Okay, then this last one that I added here was for the token whitelisting, just to talk a little bit about its how we're going to manage both releasing it and merging it into the token manager. Yeah, so I guess the main question is like whether or not you need this deployed soon or not, Arthur.
Yeah, so we discussed it, and I think that it would be better to have it before Q1 2020. I think ideally we'd like to have, Yelda will speak more to our timelines.
Yeah, so why this is important is because of, like, if we want people to earn non-transferable tokens using the projects app, which is one of our use cases. So I think it's definitely good to do some maybe even user research from this call, like talking to Luke or like Gabby, for example. Like they might have opinions on how important that is for them, because I think it's like a pretty important feature if we want non-transferable tokens and the projects app. But if people feel like it can wait till later, then we can do that too. But yeah, so
I really like the idea of having non-transferable tokens through the projects app. I am a little bit unsure about the dependency on standard bounties for a couple of reasons. So I don't know how that fits into the grand scheme of things, but just on the non-transferable token aspect, it's like it would be really, really nice. The other projects thing that kind of relates to that is like, I think it's also on your roadmap, but being able to have the bounties in DAI, but like non-transferable tokens at the same time, kind of like a hook, would also be an interesting way to approach that.
Can you go into more detail around the standard bounties question, or what your
the standard bounties flow seems like it's got a lot of like unnecessarily like transaction steps for one thing, and it also seems like we're not getting a tremendous amount of value integrating with the standard. Like isn't like an ecosystem there, and it makes it harder to do things like if we wanted to have like a hook on payout to like mint tokens, having the bounties stuff to be just like a native Aragon kind of thing would, I think, make that much easier to do. So having it be this like external dependency that's not really like aware of the Aragon stack, I think makes that more challenging. Anyways, I think that's probably a longer discussion, and I'm happy to get on like a talk and talk with you guys about that. But I don't know if this calls.
Yeah, I actually created a Notion page about that, and I believe I invited you and Maria and a few others to review it, but only Brett provided feedback on that. So yeah, maybe you can review that and add your comments as well.
Yeah, if you could send me the link again, because I am not sure I've ever seen the page, but it's possible that it just got lost in notifications or something.
We'll do.
Okay, specifically then for the token manager, it makes sense then to also have like a experimental version of each application that doesn't require as rigorous processes before publishing. I mean, the question here is like whether or not it would make sense to deploy on mainnet, and I imagine for Luke it probably does make sense. Like these are features that you would want to play with on mainnet.
Yeah, I mean, it's getting on mainnet or on like a network like XDAI or something that has real value. It makes it much easier to actually like validate these things in like practice. Nobody really cares about playing around on Rinkeby, and it becomes really hard if you want to do like a pilot on Rinkeby to like correspond like the value that is created on Rinkeby to like real value on mainnet. It like is a super manual process to be like, oh, you've got this token over here, you can burn it, and then I'll give you money on mainnet. It like feels really clunky. And there's cases where you can have just not a lot of money in an Aragon DAO that has these experimental apps on mainnet, and you have very, very low security risk. So I actually like in general feel like we should be trying to push stuff to mainnet almost exactly when we're pushing them to Rinkeby, just in like a very experimental repo, like here there be dragons kind of thing. But like allow people to use these things even before they're audited, so that you can have a much more rapid cycle. Like it's easy and cheap enough to spin up a DAO, and you don't have to put $100,000 in it. You can put like $1,000 in it, and you can run these experiments successfully.
And in particular, what about the UI? I imagine like for things like the token whitelist, you don't really need a UI. You just need to configure things using the CLI, and that'd be enough?
Yeah, for like whitelist type things, like that's totally fine.
Okay. Yeah, I think we can definitely think about even just deploying the token manager. I imagine if we did want to make it the token manager, eventually we should just make a pull request against Aragon apps. We can put it against the next branch and then deploy that on the experimental repo or the experimental repository. Okay. How does that sound to you, Arthur?
So one thing to mention, we were planning on doing like a very basic UI for potentially whitelisting, but I do agree that it's probably sufficient to just whitelist on initialization. Not on true initialization call, but when you're like deploying the template or whatever, especially for our use case, because there's basically only one thing that you're adding to the whitelist. I'm totally in favor of getting it out in some sort of experimental capacity as quickly as possible. And as long as like that's an acceptable path in terms of like OneHive's usage and getting the code used on mainnet, like I'm not super concerned about it actually being pulled into the Aragon Apps repo right now. Yelda, do you have opinions around that?
Yeah, I think the pulling it into the repo is not as major as just having some version out there and letting people use it. As far as the UI, I think it's something that in the long term we might have different attributes. For example, you might want to blacklist specific contracts from being counted towards quorum against voting, and that's kind of like very similar UI where you just have like these lists and you're assigning different attributes to the addresses. So whether that's in the token manager or not, it probably will eventually be good to have the UI so you can kind of like the permissions app, you can kind of manage and see what's going on. Because if otherwise it's hard to get that information, like what is actually whitelisted if we don't expose it somewhere in the UI.
Okay. Yeah, I guess the main point of reference is like, let's say we have these experimental deployments. Really, I guess the question is who is in control of those deployments, and at some point, is there a plan to move them into the mainstream deployments and get them audited, or is it okay if they just then stay experimental? Or like, yeah, I guess it's like on a percentage basis, it's like, are we hoping that most of these experiments land then on the main app, or is it just like we'll be kind of firing and deploying a bunch of experiments, doing different things?
I feel like tokens is pretty important, that it should eventually be like somewhere official, especially, yeah, I would say, you know, since this is a core app and tokens are what govern the DAO in some sense, and you can think of, okay, if you're creating a non-transferable token and you're adding this functionality for some addresses to be able to send it, it's a pretty important decision. So I guess people should have some confidence that it's secure. And yeah, I think eventually I don't see why we wouldn't want to include this in the default token manager eventually. Because like I said, also, we probably want more flexibility on things that might not require that much changes to the token contract, but maybe how other contracts count voting or that sort of thing.
In a more general sense, I think that anything that's going into this experimental registry should have the ultimate goal of moving out of it. Again, where it moves is not as important, but we should also be open to the idea that some of these experiments will fail and they won't move out. They'll just be orphaned code. But not this one. This one's
Okay. Yeah, I'm mainly just trying to figure out what the repository governance may look like. Because as it is right now, the easiest flow is for whoever owns the end repo to publish it, so that it's just like they manage the publishing. It gets more complicated if it's like, okay, the tokens app is something that typically Aragon 1 publishes, but then Alteryx is publishing experiments, and then when these two do need to coincide, it becomes like a kind of a fuzzy process as well. What if Aragon 1 wants to publish an experiment? Then it's like, what version do they use? So all of these different things I think are basically what I'm trying to figure out. Maybe it makes sense to even just to namespace these, like in the experimental one, where it's like, this is tokens-whitelist because it has the whitelist feature and it's published by Alteryx, and maybe eventually it'll end up in the main app. And if Aragon 1 wants to publish an experiment, they can just name it something else.
I think that's definitely going to be the cleanest process for now. I don't think there's any reason to try and make sure that the experimental version of the token manager specifically has the token manager namespace. So like tokens whitelist would be fine.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, the migration path is the big question indeed, and there are not basically the client right now. If you wanted to switch the token manager instances, it wouldn't really work very well, even if you could uninstall and reinstall the token manager. Yeah, it's a bit of a hairier process.
Yeah, it kind of seems like you need to remint all the tokens.
You wouldn't have to remint the tokens. You could, well, actually, yeah, we would have to. So there'd be 3 steps right now, and the third one wouldn't work for the UI. You would have to upgrade your token manager to have a version that can change the controller, and then you would deploy a new token manager, or new token manager with like whatever app that you wanted, and then you would use that change controller functionality to switch it to the other one and initialize it, and then uninstall the previous one. But this step here doesn't really work because the current way the events are fetched and the token manager assumes that the token is created at the same time that the token manager is created, for performance reasons primarily. And if you were to initialize the token manager after the token was actually created, more complicated things need to happen for it to know what block to start using or for it to use as the initialization block. But that's a tomorrow problem.
Yeah, I don't think this would necessarily be cleaner, but another potential upgrade path would be like cloning out the token that you're managing into a new manager. I know that you'd probably have to change other apps like that are referencing that token, but at least that path might be possible and give you the same balance, which I think is probably the more important part. But I agree, neither one of those is going to be like a particularly clean process.
Yeah, hopefully we don't have anyone who needs this huge migration process anytime soon. We're definitely not in a position to support it. Yeah, that's a great idea, Jorge. What could go wrong? Okay, so I think we have come to kind of a loose conclusion to this topic, and we're coming up on time too. So I think for action items on this, it sounds like we need to get that experimental Aragon PM repository up, and then we can go from there as to deploying this token whitelisting app.
Sounds good.
All right. Then in that case, that was all the items that were on the list. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to explain, or sorry, not explain, but discuss? All right, then we are done here. The next call then is on the 19th. That is the Berlin Blockchain Week. Hopefully people will still be able to make it. Some of you might be traveling, but we'll hold the call at the same time. That is also an open call to anybody who is watching and maybe at Berlin Blockchain Week. There's going to be a bunch of Aragon related events, and I think we'll be around at ETH Berlin as well. I think the main event that we're part of is the governance games. I think that's on the night of the 20th or 21st. I'd have to double check, but you can basically just Google the governance games, and you'll find that event. Should be a lot of fun. Hopefully anybody watching will be in town, and feel free to come to that and talk more about Aragon. Until then, until the next time, see you all Later.
Thanks.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
guys.
Bye.
Bye.